Good evening, Lorenzo.
Good evening.
Brexit is a subject that we've been talking about for the last 3 years.
Yeah, we should ask ourselves why there is Brexit given the beautiful world that Mohammed described.
Absolutely.
But okay, that's not the topic.
Well, maybe it is. Maybe it is. The opportunity out there in the world is, as we've just heard, absolutely enormous, and maybe that is what the UK is potentially trying to seek out. Yeah. Maybe the two do fit together. We have been talking about Brexit for the last 3 years, though, and the amount of conversations that you must have all had about Brexit, almost on a daily basis, I suspect if you live in London at least, have consumed huge quantities of time. Is there a danger, though, that we're becoming a little anaesthetised, maybe a little complacent about the risks and opportunities that are being posed by this move?
Well, most of you probably live in London. I spend most of my time in continental Europe. I think this risk in continental Europe is there. There is a fatigue about Brexit, and people just say, let's just do it, whatever the price is.
Whatever the price.
Which may be a hard Brexit, without fully understanding what the consequence is. That's a bit scary, I think, because we haven't thought enough about the consequences of a hard Brexit. And I hope that some more time will be given, if indeed there is an agreement in the UK, to at least work out the details and find an agreement. Maybe if it takes 3 more months, this fatigue should not prevail. I think we should try to work together to find an agreement, even if it costs 3 more months and maybe a little bit of pride.
Is your sense, though, your sense must be that the politicians have taken over. I'm not saying that politicians aren't always in kind of making fully rational decisions, but have we reached a point where it is a purely political event? You can look at Leo Varadkar in Ireland and say your economy is potentially going to suffer hugely if there is a hard Brexit. Your nearest trading partner is the UK. And the gap that exist will be absolutely enormous. But he is also looking at this through a political lens, and increasingly looks like he is looking at it through a political lens. And you could say that with other places as well.
Well, I think the choice has to be political, because it is a choice of trade-offs. Some will gain, others will lose, and the responsibility of this choice can only be political. So the important thing is that they understand all the implications. I have the sense that, and they start discussing. I understood that Theresa May never went and have a bilateral meeting with the Irish Prime Minister, which is I found this quite surprising, because in the end, I mean, these are the 2 main persons who have to deal on the issue. So hopefully this is going to get to some place and to a deal finally, where the politicians understand all the costs and benefits of any agreement, and they are the only ones who can sell it to the people in the end. So do you think
there's an opportunity here for the UK? Do you think Brexit is going to bring some good things?
It's difficult. It's difficult to say. I mean, probably at the origin of Brexit is a misunderstanding on many things: the relationship between the UK and Europe, the role of the UK in the world. I think this will be clarified in the first 2-3 years of Brexit. Either the UK can work as a standalone, or it will start having agreements again, in particular with Europe, that will make it very close, and so close that in fact the difference between being in and out will not be that different. Because if you sit at a table, negotiating table with Mr. Trump in front, he represents a market of 400 million people, you represent a market of 60, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to win that discussion. If instead you sit representing 500 million people, and maybe you're only one of the participants, maybe you get more out of it. I think this, in any democracy, you want to try. You want to try to see if you can do it better by yourself. maybe the UK is right. I have some doubts as the world is evolving, with China on one side with clear view about the world, how it will develop in the next 20, 30 years. In the UK, in the US, America first is not just an invention by Trump. I don't think that a democratic president will be any more lenient on trade. There will be, the America first concept is not only a Trump concept. And so we are in Europe in the middle, and we have a role to play, I think, if we are united. Okay, the UK people, maybe British people think that this may not be the case. We will see what will happen in the next 2, 3, 4 years. If I'm right, the UK will come back and join the European Union in 10 to 15 years' time.
You think that's going to happen?
I think the British people are very pragmatic. I mean, if
Sure.
they think that they can have, I think Britain had a very good deal inside the European Union. They were in the largest market, very successful. London is the financial center of the euro area. Many investments, a lot of influence. The impression was that you didn't really have the control of the situation. But in today's world, it's difficult to have the control on everything because we are in a global world, as we were told. So you have to work with others. You have to cooperate with others. You have to convince others. If you want to decide all by yourself, you decide for 60 million people. So you have, in the end, much less control. That's my point of view. 52% of the British people thought differently. But I think, as I said, British people are pragmatic, and they may change their mind if they find out that maybe they would have had a better deal by joining. And
Okay, let me ask you a question about those 15 years. In those 15 years, do you think the EU will reform itself? Do you think the EU will become a better EU? Because one of the concerns that the UK has is that the EU has not been good at reforming itself and has yet to kind of figure out exactly how to make that happen.
Well, I mean, we have to understand what it means, getting better. It means also being more efficient.
Yep.
It means being able to take decisions, which means if you want to take decisions, you cannot have vetoes, you cannot have unanimity. Many people in Europe think we should vote by majority on many issues. So there is a contradiction, I find, in the British position to say we have to be more efficient, but I want my veto right. You have to join the club. And actually, I understand that if you look at the numbers, Britain has been much more often on the majority side on the issues where you vote than Germany, for instance. So in the end, Britain, if you tell the right story in Britain, has been much more influential than people think in the European Union. The voting record says this.
Will Europe become a political construct in a different way over those 15 years? Do you think, there's been a lot of conversations that take place about the ever closer union. Mr. Macron is very keen to pursue this. Is that the direction of travel? Because that has always been something that I think the UK has had an issue with. So I'm curious as to how the development is going to work.
I understand a bit, but behind words, there are many misunderstandings. Again, obviously, we live in a world where there are issues coming out. The environment, this is a recent issue. Can you deal with the environment by yourself? No, obviously. You have to deal with, and you have to be influential in the world. You can try to impose your standards if you're big. Now, does it mean ever closer that, if we decide together in Europe, we get closer? Yes, we are getting closer on many issues. Are we democratic? Then, is a construct democratic enough? There are lots of improvements. But if you compare Europe today to Europe 20 years ago, certainly it has become closer together and more democratic. Fights, political fights. If you see what's happening in the European Parliament today, there are political fights. You may like it or not, but if I look at the British Parliament, there are fights there too, and that's part of democracy. So it depends whether you want to be in the big game or you want to play your own game. And I think, in football, the Premier League is certainly the best, but it doesn't mean that the other games that you play, like on the environment, on security, on many issues, Britain can play alone. So it may take some time, but I'm quite convinced that in the end we will get back together. I don't know the form, but I think the Western world, at least the Western way of life, this is the new bad word that Mrs. von der Leyen has put in her program. I think this will become one of the main values that we have to defend together. If you look around the world, at the frontier, Russia, Turkey, I don't need to, these are big challenges, and we have to be part of this discussion, and we can influence if we are together.
Do you think Britain is more culturally aligned with Europe or with the United States? We share a common language, we share many things with the United States, but where do you think the biggest cultural overlap is?
No, I think the British people feel very European when they go to the US. In the end, my impression is that Britain is much more influential by being part of Europe than by having a dialogue with the US, especially this US. But I'm not convinced that the US of Mrs. Warren would be any different. I don't know who will be Prime Minister in the UK, but to find out. But again,
sooner rather than later.
But it takes time. I think in democracies, people want to experiment. This is a big experiment, Brexit. But I'm confident the British people are pragmatic enough to understand if this experiment doesn't work, to try to build something different and maybe rejoin. I think together we are stronger. I don't know if this is a presidential campaign. I don't know who said
British,
this.
One of the British parties said that as well, maybe.
I don't remember. It sounds nice.
Where does Brexit stack up in terms of the risks that you see in front of you and your business? How important is it? There are plenty of challenges that the banks face right now, that Europe faces right now. Where does Brexit sit in that?
So for the financial sector, it is a big risk. It is a big risk because if we don't have continuity for the financial system, it is a disaster. So an agreed Brexit would have, the equivalence concept that would at least allow for a very long transition and maybe the continuation of the role of London being very important for all the banking system, for the financial system. If we had a hard Brexit, then it is a problem because the continuity of contracts, the continuity of business will be put in question. We have to rely on the regulators, so not on the politicians, but on the technical level, the agreement between, for instance, the Bank of England and the ECB, to have continuity. Otherwise, it is a major shock. And we've seen in the past that when there are doubts, when there are uncertainties, these financial shocks then become a real economy shock. If you remember, one of the things I'm concerned, for instance, if you remember Lehman Brothers,
vividly,
the crisis of Lehman Brothers. I mean, Lehman Brothers was a small bank. But why do you remember? If I ask you, why do you remember? What are the images that you have in front of you?
The first image that comes into my mind is people walking out with boxes.
Exactly. And these images were shown all over the world. And it had an incredible impact. Now, imagine similar images, about trucks lining up, people getting mad. Maybe people cannot find certain products here and there, lining up in shops. I mean, I'm sure that, the media world would love to project these images about Europe making a mess of itself. But this uncertainty, I think, would create quite an impact on the emotion, on the sentiment, on entrepreneurs all over the world, on people, and consumption would stop, investment would stop, and we could have also a recession that is difficult to forecast today because these elements, this sentiment is not included in economic models. It's a non-linear, what we call non-linearities that are very difficult to forecast, but in the end transform a Lehman Brothers failure into a global recession.
So this is a systemic event.
It's a systemic event. It's a butterfly, and this we are underestimating, this mediatic sentiment. So This is why it's very important, and it's the responsibility of politicians to make sure that we have an agreement, that if we have problems, we address them together, because it's in the interest of Europe and the UK to solve and to avoid these shocks and this panic that can happen from it.
Do you think the UK will become a regulatory competitor in the financial world to Europe? And if it does, presumably that's going to make managing those kind of situations even more difficult.
The temptation is there. I mean, let's be frank. I mean, why do you want to get out of the union? Is to try to be more competitive, in the end. And that's a risk that I see, because in the financial sector, certainly, we will have, and the place of London will depend on these reciprocal agreements and the concept of equivalence. If the UK regulators and politicians think that there is an opportunity to get an advantage from Brexit, get more business, trying to be competitive, then at a certain point there will be a reaction. And I'm concerned about this instability that could be created by the interpretation of the concept of equivalence. Because, what does it mean, being equivalent? The two of you, we have to agree. But if at a certain point you move in a direction that is testing, and the concept itself, try to, let's take an example, remuneration of bankers. We have a regulation in Europe, which probably bankers don't like necessarily, but it has been agreed by the political system, following what happened after Brexit, after the crisis. If now you want to become more competitive, you want to relax it, I'm not sure this would be the case, that the British people would accept that. But if this was the direction to take, then it means that you're testing, you're trying to to get advantages. Then at some point you may become conflict, and there will be a conflict, and there will be retaliation, and we may. So before these 10 years or 15 years, there may be 2 or 3 years of bumpy relationships, which may not be that nice, and this will be to the detriment of both our economies.
Do you think a hard Brexit, and many people increasingly talk of hard Brexit as being their base case scenario, actually has the advantage of taking politics out of the Brexit event? At the moment, we feel everything, as you say, is political. And I'm just wondering how we short-circuit that, get away from that. Would a hard Brexit actually create an environment in which we put the politics to one side and allow the more technical aspects of the divorce to be dealt with? I'm wondering how we deal and get away from the politics without kind of a dream of a deal which looks increasingly unlikely.
But I mean, in the very short term, it may be the case. So let's suppose there is a big issue in this relationship between Europe and the UK is the clearing system of derivatives and so forth, which is clearly in London. It's going to be very difficult to move the liquidity outside London for now. So let's suppose we have a hard Brexit. What happens? Well, hopefully there will be an agreement between the UK and the European authorities to try to have some continuity. But this is not without any political consequence, because suppose there is a problem in the clearing system in the UK. Will the taxpayer in the UK back? Will the political system accept that the taxpayer bears the burden of any problem? So it is a political issue. It cannot be, delayed for too long. So, behind the structure of the financial system, in the end, there are key political decisions to take. So, in the end, the politicians cannot, get away with taking responsibility. On top of that, if you have a hard Brexit, there will be people suffering. There will be, a crisis. So the politicians cannot just say, I wasn't there. It's their responsibility, and that's why I'm confident that in the end, even behind the desire to be in charge, you have to take responsibility for the good of your country, and it is the good of the UK and the good of Europe to find an agreement, even if it takes a few more weeks or a few more months. I mean, but at a certain point, we need a solution because we are entering into a global slowdown, which is, dangerously close to being a recession, and this uncertainty is starting to hurt. So we need a solution within a clear delay, and then we'll start betting on how long it will take to marry again.
Okay, 15 years. Well, as somebody who spends an awful lot of time standing outside Westminster, I hope you are right that it gets resolved soon, because the winter is coming. And believe you me, it can be extremely cold out there at 10 o'clock at night when the MPs are inside, very warm, making their decisions or not. Lorenzo, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Lorenzo Bini Smaghi.